Hello, and welcome to Wallace's Mysteries of Antiquity. Subscribe to the channel to join me in exploring the enigmas of our distant ancestors and try to come to tentative conclusions about them. To the southwest of Khufu's Great Pyramid lies the pyramids of his descendants. The third pyramid, the smallest of the major ones, belonged to Pharaoh Menkaure, Khufu's grandson, and most likely the son of Khafre, who owned the other major pyramid at the site. Its most prominent feature, being the Great Scar, was created by Murad Bey in the 1790s and likely continued by Muhammad Pasha. You may have heard from either History for Granted, Ancient Architects, Mark Lehner, or even Zahi Hawass that the scar was made in 1196, but they're wrong. Check out this video for the details. I didn't realize until just after I published that video that John Perring apparently knew this, and the information had been lost between him and modern times. Here's by Bey written in his diagrams. This excavation by Howard Weiss goes all the way into the center and then down to the bedrock. He was attempting to figure out a way inside, but had yet to dig out the sand concealing the real entrance, which he found on July 29, 1837. The outside was originally cased with rounded granite, up at least 16 courses, and possibly up to 25. Above this was once polished Tora limestone, possibly painted red. It's possible the granite base was meant to be left rustic, though it's also possible that they were meant to be smooth if Menkaure had lived long enough. Like many of the other pyramids, the original casing stones have fallen or been pulled off. The granite pieces were especially valuable and reused in both modern Cairo and Alexandria. You can see many of them laying around in the sand at the base of the pyramid. Some of the casing stones were removed by Sultan Uthman in 1196, but for centuries after that, multiple visitors said that Menkaure's casing stones were largely still intact, even after the 1303 earthquake, which damaged the other two. It seems most of the casing stones did not come off until the 1700s. On the east side, there is a temple like most pyramids. This one seemed to have been partially constructed in a hurry. Most Egyptologists believe that Menkaure likely died before his pyramid complex was actually completed. Ancient architects proposed there may be a second entrance to another chamber system in the east face because of a smooth set of casing stones there, like the entrance. However, in my opinion, it's merely marked the location of a stela in the temple. But there may have yet been another smooth section in the west face, which I guess could have been anything, at least according to M&R in the 1967 book L'Architettura del Piramide Menfi Part 6. We cannot even be sure that the smooth section of the casing stones is original. Next to the entrance, there is an inscription, claiming this as the tomb of Menkaure the Divine, who died on the 23rd day of summer, without any date mentioned. Believed likely inscribed by Kamaras, son of Ramses II, this shows the New Kingdom was doing something with this structure and may have heavily modified it. It certainly also had gone through several iterations during the life of Menkaure. You'll notice that this pyramid actually has two descending passages, but one of them is cut off by the pyramid masonry. The chisel marks of the upper passage indicate it was dug from the outside in, and had a lintel over the entrance, indicating that it was left open, for a while at least. And in my opinion, this likely shows the initial plan was a more humble mastaba. Greek historian Herodotus said that Menkaure was told by the oracle of Buto that he would only reign for 6 years. I normally don't give Herodotus much credit with things this far before his time, but it may explain why the initial plan seemed so humble. Having had actually ruled for somewhere between 18 and 22 years, this was expanded to a full pyramid with a longer passageway to enter it. This passageway seemed to have been dug from the inside out, showing us that it was dug after the upper one. Next to Menkaure's pyramid, he also created 3 minor pyramids. It's likely at least 2 of them belonged to his wives, and it's possible one was for his Ka. In my 3rd video ever, I followed the exploration of Howard Weiss of the middle minor pyramid, and showed that a mummy still likely exists inside it to this day. The entrance to the pyramid is on the north side, found by Howard Weiss just below the Great Scar and above the inscription. There is a rounded lintel above it, making it seem like the entrance was never meant to be hidden. But again, this could be a New Kingdom modification. When entering the pyramid, you must bend down, although it's been said this entrance is one of the easiest. It's fairly tall, not very long, and has an average slope. You can see granite lintels forming the ceiling for the first little bit, as you start on the 5th course up and head towards the underground. As you transition from within the masonry to where the underground section of the passage starts, you can see the base of the pyramid above you with a small hole that apparently shows the face of one of the hidden steps of the step structure underneath. At the bottom of the passageway, you'll enter the first room. This room has a beautiful palace facade on the walls. It is clear to me that this room was intended to be visited, especially considering the obvious and accessible entranceway. Notice that there are no robbers' tunnels in this pyramid. Looters seem to know exactly where they needed to go and likely simply followed the passageways. Continuing forward, we see another door with a rounded top inviting us to continue forward. In antiquity, this is actually where our journey would have ended, as the next room once held a 3-stone portcullis mechanism similar to Khufu's. This entire doorway was found on the floor by Howard Weiss and has been reconstructed. That chunk of granite on the floor, I believe, came from the portcullis room. However, it could also be a leftover part of these massive granite blocks that Howard Weiss found in the facade room. These apparently blocked access to the next room and had to be removed. This begs the question, who put these stones here and where did they come from? Did the Sates shove them down the entranceway after replacing the sarcophagus? Or did they once belong to the portcullis mechanism, maybe? The portcullis room has been completely destroyed, though we aren't sure when this happened. It likely happened when the pyramid was first looted, probably in the Second Intermediate period, but it's also possible it was ripped out by the Sates. Here you can see Keith Hamilton's 3D model of the portcullis room, as well as holes that held logs to lower the granite doors. Weiss said he found fragments of granite here, but the portcullises themselves have never been seen. I think the Sates probably removed whatever remained of them. On the other side of the portcullis room, you'd go under another damaged lintel. This one is still in place, and then you'll enter a rather tall hallway that'll get you to the upper chamber. You reach the upper chamber via this hallway, one of the few places in Egypt where a lot of people don't even need to bend over. In what I guess we'd consider the door frame, you can see a log hole. This is clever because it allows a log to be put in place transversely, but also makes a log hole essentially impossible to hide later. When walking into the upper chamber, the first thing you will see are these deep log holes. They're about a foot across and about 30 to 40 centimeters deep. When viewing a diagram from the side, we can see that they all line up with each other. I propose that they sectioned the chamber into upper and lower floors, and I'll bet a ramp allowed access between them and was used to drag materials from the lower tunnel dig out the upper tunnel. To the left of the door when entering, you'll see a number of large stones. Stones have been moved around quite a bit, and I'm not sure exactly where these came from. I believe these once plugged the downward ramp in the middle of the room. Above, where you entered from, is the original passage. Keith Hamilton calls it a construction passage, noting that this contemporary mastaba has a similar 2-tier passage system. It was plugged in antiquity, and Howard Weiss found several blocking stones still in situ, and I believe they're actually still there. I wanted to find you guys a picture of the inside, but I don't know of any. If some viewer would point a camera down that passage and hold it still for 5 to 10 seconds, I'd love to stack those frames and get an image. Ancient architects held this position for about 2 seconds, giving me about 60 frames of light data. I was able to pull out the ceiling up until the passage turns upwards. This chamber is nearly identical in size and shape to the chamber in Khafre's monument, just much taller and with a decorated eastern wall. I find it most likely that it was dug in 2 phases. The floor would have been level with the upper entrance, whilst the structure was just a mastaba. It was continued down after there was decided to make it a pyramid, maybe after he had already outlived the oracle's prediction of 6 years. In the east side, you also see a variety of blocks. These were most likely what plugged the ramp to the lower chamber. But let's talk about some history of this upper section first, because we encounter a few mysteries here. When Weiss was excavating it, there was a coffin and parts of a mummy found here, as well as a stone sarcophagus lid. It was discovered under 3 feet of rubbish that lined the entire place. It's most likely that all of this came from unplugging the 19 meters upper passage, opened by looters searching for more chambers. Pairing shows several big stones still in situ. It may be possible to confirm that's where the rubbish came from, because in operations carried on at Giza, Weiss says that Menkaure's quarry was used as a dump, so I assume that's where this rubbish still is. Since we have a carbon date for the skeleton underneath, we can be confident the upper passage was unplugged by looters sometime after the early Christian period. The radiocarbon dating showed researchers that the skeleton was younger than the wooden coffin, which is stylistically of the Sate period, about 500 BC. The skeleton is an invasive burial, from the 1st century or so. The style of the coffin is of the Sate period, but it is not invasive. It's a restoration, and was meant for Menkaure. This is his cartouche right here. Ra, Men, Ka. Ra is written first because he's a god. Hieroglyphics are weird. It's also why I've changed my pronunciation of his name since my last video. I think Ra would probably be the emphasized syllable. We know Ra was the last sound of his name because of Greek transliterations. Within the decorated eastern wall, you will notice another window behind a modern gate. This was once masoned up, but I can't tell from Weiss's writing if it was already dismantled when he arrived or if he did it. Keith Hamilton wonders if perhaps the entire room was plastered to try to hide this masonry, but that doesn't seem likely to me. The entire room is obviously bedrock. You'd have to cover absolutely everything to make any masonry hidden. Look at how obvious these strata lines are along the western wall. Limestone is a sedimentary stone, so it has a lot of marks like this. It'd be very hard to make masonry look natural. I think this room was entirely abandoned in a rough state. You can see where they just plain stopped leveling the floor, near where a notch for a sarcophagus is very crudely cut. This is mismatched with the quality of work you see above the sarcophagus hole. Above it, there is this beautifully decorated paneling. This makes sense when you remember that they dug this chamber from the top down, so it's logical for features of the ceiling to be more finished than the floor, which would have been last, and probably not even finished. The purpose of the window is to access the roof of the burial chamber. The lower chamber is just below this window, and they use this maneuvering space to get the huge granite beams into place. These are the granite beams that make up the breathtaking ceiling below. I have no idea why in modern times they appear white. Is this plaster or just dust? These older images show the granite color. The biggest obvious difference between the Khafre and Menkaure floor plan is the ramp in the middle of Menkaure's. You can see how tall this passage is now, but this is not how it was when Howard Weiss found it. The discovery of the ramp is actually the reason Khafre's chamber, which I'm showing you now, is currently missing its floor. Upon unearthing the one in Menkaure's pyramid, John Pairing promptly walked to this pyramid and pulled up the floor hoping to find a similar ramp. Within this ramp, we encounter another mystery. On the top left corner, I'm showing you a diagram of how this hallway was once lined on all sides with granite. It looks like about half of the height was used for a ceiling lintel, and the passageway was plugged with stones. Looters actually found it easier to remove the ceiling lintels than the plug stones, which is how they gained access and removed the coffin. Now the puzzle of the timeline starts to get weird. We can't actually be sure anything below the upper section was actually made by the Old Kingdom. At very least, the granite casing of the ramp must have been built by the Sate. When lined with granite, this ramp is narrower than the sarcophagus. The Sate could not have got it down there if this passage was already lined. Weiss was forced to remove all of it to get it out. This had led many to question if the entire lower section may have been created by the Sate period. Personally, I think the lower chamber probably existed since the Old Kingdom, and it's probably where Menkaure was laid. Why would the Sates dig a whole separate chamber and magazine for a restoration job? They didn't do that anywhere else, as far as we know. But I think it probably was in rough shape. If Menkaure died before it was finished, the lower section may have been barely put together. If the Sates found it this way, perhaps they completed whatever work they saw as not finished yet, including securing the ramp after they introduced the new sarcophagus. Going down the ramp, in front of you is the burial chamber, and to the right is something you don't normally see in Old Kingdom pyramids, a magazine chamber. None of the other 4th Dynasty pharaohs have magazines like this, though plenty of Middle Kingdom pyramids do. You might think it's unusual, but in fact this is fairly common for mastabas at the time. For example, Shepsheket's in Saqqara has a similar layout. It's only unusual for a pyramid. They'd likely store food, supplies for the afterlife, and possibly canopic chests for their organs. It was entered by a descending staircase to ensure that if anything rotted, it wouldn't seep into other rooms. When ancient architects and ancient site girl visited there were muography plates inside, but Skin Pyramids hasn't released anything yet, and personally, I don't really expect to find anything. I think the core is solid. There is a niche in the wall opposite the magazine, so they must have been turning large items into it, probably some type of furniture, or they may have stored his sarcophagus here while the chamber was being completed. Finally, the fabulous King's Chamber. In a void carved by bronze tools deep underground, they constructed this room with blocks of granite that had to have been slid down the main passage and maneuvered into place in tight quarters. In some places, the wall is known to be at least 2 blocks thick. The floor has been dug up, and when Howard Weiss found the room, a sarcophagus from the Sate era was here. In order to protect it from the damage that it certainly would have encountered if left in situ, he dismantled the casings of the ramp and removed it. It was set on a ship named the Beatrice. There were a number of ships with this name, but it's possible that this is her in this painting, Beatrice of Dundee at Simo Bay, September 17, 1832. But she sank in the Mediterranean near the Strait of Gibraltar. Sadly, the coffin now rests at the bottom of the Mediterranean. Salt water doesn't hurt basalt, so hopefully future historians can salvage it and bring it back to Egypt. On the event, Howard Weiss writes, quote, "It embarked from Alexandria in autumn of 1838, on board a merchant vessel before it disappeared off of Cartagena. We have not heard from it since leaving Livorno in October 12th this year." End quote. Luckily, the coffin and mummy did make it to London without issue, and can be found in the British Museum, though not actually on display. Surprisingly, Weiss records that it seemed insects, animals, and even large birds were regulars to this chamber. He states that the sarcophagus seemed to be their favorite perch. This is really strange, as you'd have to go through quite a bit of tunnels to reach the chamber, and birds don't really like caves. It also gives us an idea for how long the chamber might have been accessible for. The barrel ceiling is unique for an Old Kingdom pyramid, as is the orientation of this room. It's likely that the ceiling represents the curve of the heavens. The sun rose in the east, rotated over the coffin, and set in the west. This design was imitated by the Middle Kingdom. There are a few holes in the walls. I'm not sure if these were looting probes or Egyptologist probes. Behind some parts of the wall, there is bedrock, and behind other parts, there is another layer of granite. On the entrance to the chamber, Howard Weiss found written in ancient Arabic the name Muhammad Rasul. We have no idea who this is. Was he the first to breach the chamber? Was he perhaps the one who moved the wooden coffin and sarcophagus lid to the upper section? Did he know, or could he be the man whose remains we found above? Or was this just a visitor, lucky enough to see the lower section before later looters concealed it up with rubbish? The Pyramid of Menkaure really seems like a stepping stone between the structures of the Old and Middle Kingdom. And so much has happened here in antiquity that fitting together a logical order of events is like a puzzle. And until recently, it was off limits. While I usually use Isida project images, they never even went inside this one. So big thanks again to Ancient Architects Keith Hamilton and Ancient Sites Girl for their footage from inside. Thank you for listening. Respectfully discuss this amazing pyramid in the comments, and subscribe if you wish to continue to join me in exploring the enigmas of our distant ancestors.